Hey, this video lecture is going to be focusing specifically on the NASW Code of Ethics, so the National Association of Social Workers Code of Ethics. What you'll find with this content, it's not necessarily the most, I don't want to say engaging, but maybe not the most glamorous topic. It's not, I don't want to say it's boring either because it's really good stuff, but it's a lot of historical content. But what you're going to want to keep in mind is this is incredibly important, if not one of the most important things that you need to remember from this class. I like to refer to the Code of Ethics as the Bible of social work. It's a foundational piece that drives the profession in kind of keeping social work practitioners accountable for their actions to make sure that we are not doing harm to our clients. It covers and touches every aspect of social work, no matter what your position or role is. And social workers, once they receive their degree, have that kind of informal agreement that they are going to abide by the Code of Ethics. And it doesn't really fly in the social work field if you're like, well, I didn't know about the Code of Ethics, or I didn't know it was in there. So whoopsies, I can't be responsible for doing this harm to the client. Nope, there's the expectation that you will know and understand, not word for word, but you need to know how this document guides your practice because you are assuming responsibility to adhering to it. So this is incredibly important. We're going to kind of talk about the history of the Code of Ethics and what the purpose of it is. In later lessons, we'll be fleshing out different components and looking at those more specifically. So this is kind of an overview of the code, but again, it's setting the stage and foundation for the other topics and preparing you to enter into the social work field. So the beginning of social work. So social work, if you can remember way back from intro to social work class, social work as a profession didn't really become a thing until 1955. So the late 19th century. Prior to that, a lot of social work roles and duties as we know them today were performed by volunteers as a charitable act, kind of some connection to the church. It was more of a very informal helping activities, I guess, because I don't want to say helping profession. So informally helping people through different activities. So in 1955, the very first Code of Ethics was written by the newly created National Association of Social Workers. And this Code of Ethics was 1 page long. Now, if you've ever looked at the Code of Ethics currently, you know it is no longer 1 page long. It is multiple pages with lots of sections, lots of content. It's an ever-evolving document. And so I think that's important to know because the world does change. We're not a stagnant society. New ethical issues arise, and we have to be flexible and adapt and be also aware of the changes so we know what the expectations are when we are performing this professional role. So there's really 5 distinct periods, I guess, in the evolution of the Code of Ethics. Some of them kind of overlapped, but they're kind of sequential. So we are going to go through each stage. So the first one is the morality period. So in the early stages of the social work profession, becoming more of the profession versus just kind of like helper activities, the focus was very much on the morality of the client and not at all about the ethical decision-making and morality of the providers. So it was very like, this client is in this particular situation because of their immoral choices. And so we need to address the immorality of the client to better society. Now, I can judge, and I think there's definitely room for judging on this, but that is the mindset of that period of time. They were still had good intentions, still wanted to improve the well-being of others and improving and building a stronger and healthier society. However, their approach did not really take into consideration the impact of the environment on the client and how that might influence their choices and decisions and situations. So there was the concern about the moral fiber or the lack thereof of the clients who are experiencing different issues they were addressing. So a person was in poverty or unemployed or using alcohol or had poor health because of their immoral choices. Now, sometimes that might be true, but also that is not necessarily the same stance that we have today. So the phrase of professional ethics didn't really exist, again, because it was focused so much more on the immorality of clients versus holding any of the providers accountable for what they were doing with their clients or how they were trying to help. So during this period, there was a rather paternalistic tone. Now, you're going to hear that word a couple of times throughout this video lecture, and I actually have a second video lecture after this that will focus specifically on personal or on paternalism. But essentially what it means, like if the root, like you think about the Latin word that it was derived from, it's kind of that mindset of like father knows best. So someone's coming in and telling the client that they know what's best for their situation. So I am going to tell you how to change, how to fix it. I am the expert in the situation, not the client in the situation. Now, that description I just gave has a kind of a negative overtone, but there's really good intentions by it. Like you have a genuine desire to help. However, it just goes kind of backwards from what social work is today. It's kind of patronizing. It's telling others what they need to do. It creates a hierarchy. At times, paternalism actually is horrible if it's intentional. But usually paternalism that we see in social work is rather unintentional because it has good intentions, but it's not actually healthy and the best approach for client work. So my next slide or my next video lecture will really flesh that out. But it was really evident during this period. So then they kind of transitioned later in the 1960s to 1970s. There was more of a social reform vibe in that they were looking at kind of more of like what's right or wrong in society versus what's wrong with the clients. So scholars and practitioners began exploring and writing about the profession's core values. So we're now becoming more specific. So those values of like client dignity, self-worth, self-determination, confidentiality, those more specifics were starting to be put into place because they wanted to make sure that practitioners were doing the right thing for their clients and not causing more harm. So like I mentioned, the 1960s, 1970s, social reform and the broader society's influence were written about in regards to ethical values. So now we're starting to establish more of that universal approach that the profession is now going to be guided by. So this is kind of where a little bit of the overlap is. It kind of transitioned into more of this ethical dilemma and decision-making period. So this began in the late 1970s and early 1980s with the emergence of applied and professional ethics, especially bioethics. So ethics cover a lot of different professions, not just necessarily social work. So there are scholars across medicine, nursing, and law. They started writing about real life ethical challenges that practitioners were facing and how does the practitioner's moral standing, how does the client's ethical or moral standing kind of integrate what happens when there's tension and then these ethical dilemmas manifest in themselves. So this kind of built into creation of more social work topics and more kind of guidance in the code of ethics. It built on confidentiality, giving your client informed consent, boundary issues like with dual relationships, if there's a conflict of interest between the client and the practitioner, and compliance with different laws and making sure there was no illegal activities occurring from the practitioner's end, but also if your client is conducting an illegal activity, what is the social worker's role within a dilemma like that? So over time, education programs kind of developed specific curricula to teach their social work students about ethical dilemmas and decision making. So they found value in, we can't just tell our social workers that this is happening and you're going to have to deal with it, but they started doing evidence-based research of how can we equip our professionals in the workspace and whatever their practice is to be able to navigate these dilemmas well. And this then transitioned into the 1990s, so really not that long ago. It focused on the links between ethical judgment and potential malpractice or professional discipline. So now this was the movement of strengthening some protections for the clients now, that if their social worker was doing something that was considered unethical, there was now room for actual consequences to be implemented, not just necessarily don't do that, but hey, if you do that, here are the consequences that are going to happen in your ability to practice social work. So licensing boards were developed. So websites listed sanctioned social workers and showing their offenses. There could be fraud, boundary violations, unauthorized disclosure, so violation of confidentiality, if you mismanaged funds, all those types of things. And those websites still exist today. Sometimes it's actually kind of entertaining in a sad way. If you pull it up and just kind of read the charges, sometimes it just blows my mind that people in a helping profession end up making the decisions that they get sanctioned for. I'm actually going to talk about that in part 2 of today's lesson. But yes, now there was more accountability for the social workers to make sure that they were practicing in ethical and legal ways. But on maybe a good side or bad side, I'm not sure, but it shifted from asking what's the right thing to do more into the mindset of, can I be sued? How can I protect myself? So risk management became a new component of social work training. And for the first time, literature explored the intersection of ethical judgment, negligence, and professional discipline. So again, you can kind of see it growing from a very simplistic desire to have a code of professional ethics into like, hey, there's a lot more to this that we have to make sure we're fleshing out. And then finally, the digital period. And this is kind of where we are at right now. Obviously, with the growth of technology, social workers now can provide services via video, text, online, and this faces unique boundary challenges with any type of social media interaction. This really got amplified during COVID when we were forced to go online and provide all of our services virtually versus face to face. And so, thankfully, the Code of Ethics had already implemented a updated version in 2017 that gave guidelines around social media use, electronic, all the technology pieces. So they were actually prepared for that huge shift during COVID. But I think, as we know, like the digital world is still really evolving. So it wouldn't be surprising if more guidance was added in the future, because we're seeing a really big shift in service provision. So there's that plus side that the internet can act as a therapeutic tool. They can offer specialized apps, alerts, virtual supports for clients, all really good things. But new technology does bring in ethical challenges around privacy, consent, not borders. That's just supposed to be boundaries, prompting regulatory bodies to develop new guidelines. And like I mentioned, in 2017, the code was updated with guidance to equip social workers for navigating the very complex and wonderful digital landscape that we are currently experiencing. So in conclusion, I think hopefully this point got across that social work ethics is a moving target. We're teaching you ethics. I'm teaching you what the current code says, how to navigate it, but it very well could change over the years, and I'm going to have to adapt new curricula and new approaches. The good thing is a lot of it is evidence-based. It is not just some people saying, again, this is what you should do. When they updated the code in 2017, it was a 2-year process. They started the task force in 2015 because they want to make sure the guidance is evidence-based, it's valid, and it does what the intent is of it. So in conclusion, really, like once upon a time, a one-page code of ethics sufficed. However, it just no longer does. So that is the history of the code in a nutshell. Good information to know, to kind of see like this is where we're started and this is where we are now. And it'll be really interesting to see where it goes in the future. So part 2 of this video lecture is now going to talk about kind of understanding and using the code of ethics. Back when I was in college, we were all provided with a paper copy of the Code of Ethics. It is now digital. It's really actually super easy to have access to. You just Google NASW Code of Ethics and it will pull up the whole digital document for you. So there's really no excuse saying that you didn't know where it was or having access to it, because if you got access to the internet, you have access to the Code of Ethics. So really, what the Code of Ethics aimed to do was to have a document that embodies the values of the profession and help guide the behavior of the members who are acting out of it. So social workers. Clients aren't held to the Code of Ethics. This is for providers to adhere to. So our profession, like I said, uses the Code of Ethics, and it was developed by the NASW. So overall, like for any profession, an ethical code is meant to focus the attention and give direction in matters that demand the exercise of our own judgment. This is kind of, the Code of Ethics is helpful for subjective situations. So obviously, like we know 2 + 2 is 4. So we know that is always going to be the answer. But in the social work field, you can't say a client plus a housing crisis equals bad decisions. It is so subjective. It is so, every situation is so different because people are dynamic and own individuals. So such a code is intended to create insight into ethical norms, so establishing what is kind of expected for the profession and to focus attention on ethical issues. This adds clarity to the tasks and should lead to greater ethical observance within the organization. So it's kind of bringing in that accountability piece. In an ethical code, important themes can be brought forward that were not necessarily found in sources or rules or regulations. So an agency might have their specific policies, but an ethical code is going to be that overarching umbrella that drives those policies. It helps serves as a guide when you're trying to take a stance on an ethical dilemma, and it contributes to strengthening the professional identity. And whoops, I didn't mean to draw green on there. What is happening? I didn't mean to do that. The code has both been a symbolic and a guiding role, and is a reminder that the person practicing a profession is also representative of that profession. Apparently, Google wanted to change profession to progression when I was typing this up, so that's fun. So overall, I think the Code of Ethics, the purpose of it is to maintain that integrity. I know I put identity here, but I think I should also add integrity, because it is showing that the workers are intentional about serving their clients well and holding themselves accountable to ethical choices. And I think that's a huge piece of it. Now, I have to apologize for this slide. For some reason, when I was making the slideshow, I could not apply the theme to this one. So this is really boring, but it still has good content. So a code of ethics sets forth values, ethical principles, and ethical standards to which professionals aspire and by which their actions can be judged. So this is giving us motivation, but it's also, again, holding us accountable. Social workers' ethical behavior should result from their personal commitment to engage in ethical practice, and the code reflects the commitment of all social workers to uphold the profession's values and act ethically. This is incredibly important in social work because we work with humans, and often with very, very vulnerable humans. And so we have that position of power, and if we use our power in an unethical way, it can cause great harm to clients, and that kind of strips away some of their dignity and the respect that we should have for them. Now, it is important to know that if there is a violation of any of the standards in the code, it does not necessarily imply that legal charges are going to be brought, or that you're going to jail for something, or you violated the law. The only people who can determine that is made in like legal and judicial proceedings. If there's any alleged violations of the code, it goes through a peer review process. So it's not like if you murdered somebody, you would be going to jail. If you accidentally disclose protected health information, you're not necessarily going to go to jail, but there might be some consequences or sanctions on your license depending on the subjective nature of the violation. So I think that's good to know. Later on in the course, we're going to talk kind of about what happens when there is ethical violations on the code. But for now, just know that if you do violate something in the code of ethics, it isn't automatic legal jail time, but there is potential anticipated consequences. So the code of ethics is the document itself is divided into 4 different sections. Section 1 is the preamble. It just summarizes the social work profession's mission and core values. There's not a lot of like direction on how to handle ethical dilemmas in that section, but it does provide kind of setting the stage of why we do what we do. So section 2 outlines the Code of Ethics main functions, giving a brief guide for dealing with ethical issues or dilemmas in social work practice. So it's kind of, again, getting more specific, setting the stage that this is a tool to be used to help empower you. So then it goes into kind of like the broader principles in section 3. These are based on the social work's core values that actually inform social work practice. So if I go to this slide, you can see there's 6 key ethical practices or principles. The first one is integrity. Social workers are expected to act honestly and transparently in all their professional dealings. They're expected to take accountability, so you take responsibility for your actions and your consequences. We value confidentiality because that respects and protects the privacy of clients and sensitive information. There is a principle of fairness that we treat all individuals respect and without discrimination. We are professionals. There's a level of professionalism that social workers are called to act under. So we maintain a high standard of conduct and competence in our field. And we just have respect for others. So we value the rights and dignity of all individuals involved. So that can be our clients, it can be our peers, it can be other professionals, society as a whole. We really lean into that inherent dignity and respect for all. So I'm going to pop back to this one because then it fleshes out into ethical standards. So these include the specific standards to guide social workers' conduct and provide a basis for I cannot say that word, education. I'm not even going to try right now. So basically for discipline or for sanctions, basically consequences if you do something that violates those ethical principles that I just shared. Now, I haven't listed out all the ethical standards because there's quite a few of them, but it does show, gives very, actually, I don't want to say clear guidance because the Code of Ethics is not very black and white, for better or for worse, but it gives a lot of like, hey, if this occurs, this is what you should do. If you choose not to, you still assume responsibility if the client is harmed within the interaction. So the ethical standards is really the meat of the Code of Ethics, and often where we go and refer to when struggling or trying to process an ethical dilemma. I just read all those key principles. Essentially, overall, social workers have this ethical responsibility to different parties. This is not just focusing on client professional interactions, but we have a responsibility, obviously, to our clients. So there's a lot of guidance around how we interact with our clients. We have responsibility to our colleagues, so making sure we're acting in a competent manner, making sure that we're holding others in our profession accountable. It kind of fleshes that out as well. There's a lot of responsibility to your practice setting, so making sure that you are maintaining confidentiality, giving your clients informed consent, that you are not practicing outside of your scope of expertise. We have the ethical responsibility to the profession, so having that integrity piece, and just broader society in general. So our actions do impact broader society. And so we have to look at how that would kind of manifest in different settings. I think the cool thing about this is this really shows all the different levels of social work. So it aligns really well kind of with that generalist perspective of social workers working at the micro level, the meso level, the macro level, and then the global level as well. So there are some challenges in utilizing the Code of Ethics. It doesn't always provide a clear direction, and sometimes Tenets of the code of ethics actually conflict with each other. And that's kind of where those ethical dilemmas lie. If I'm maintaining confidentiality, but my client discloses that they are going to harm themselves or others, I have to break that confidentiality because I'm also held to protecting client safety. So you can see that there is conflict. Um, but as we go through the course, we're going to learn how to kind of navigate those things. But I think that's a reality of it, that there is just a lot of gray area, and it's meant to provide direction, not give you conclusive answers. So the code is a useful tool for identifying possible areas of difficulty. It offers guidelines for social workers as they interact with clients and fellow professionals. So knowing the code is really that essential first step, because you're going to have to use it to guide your practice decisions in the future. So familiarity, having the knowledge, is going to help empower you when ethical dilemmas do arise. So specific applications of the code must take into account the context which it is being considered and the possibility of conflicts among the code's values, principles, and standards. So kind of applying that person and environment mindset to the code of ethics. We can't, again, look at it as a black and white document because context changed so much. We talked about the cultural context last week. Religious context. There's so many factors that could be influencing people's decisions, ourselves included, that we have to make sure we take into account of that. But essentially, ethical responsibilities flow from all human relationships, from the personal to the familial to the social and the professional. So this is really a process. Social workers should take into consideration all the values, principles, and standards in the code that are relevant to situations when ethical judgment is warranted. And so social workers' decisions and actions should be consistent with the spirit as well as the letter of this code. When using the code of ethics and entering into the space where ethical dilemmas exist, social workers should consult relevant literature on professional ethics, seek appropriate consultation when faced with ethical dilemmas. So this can include agency-based or social work organizations, ethics committees, other regulatory bodies, and legal counsel, depending on your funding source. And using your colleagues and supervisors. Supervisors are your best friend. It's really important to have a good relationship with your supervisor because sometimes you just need that outside perspective. They might be operating under a different moral philosophy than you are. And so it's always good to have that collaboration when you're consulting around ethical dilemmas. So there's that. There's a lot of information that I just gave you. A lot of it, some of it's a little bit repetitive, but I think if you're going to take anything away from it, is you need to know the code of ethics. You don't need to memorize it and be able to share it verbatim, but you need to know its content. You need to know how to use it to guide you. And the more familiar you become with it, the more it'll empower you and equip you when difficult decisions arise. It is not meant to be a constricting document saying you can't do this, you can't do that, you can't help a person in the way that you want to because the code says you can't. It's meant to protect you and to empower you and give good direction, so you can really help your clients in the best way possible, but also protect yourself while doing it. So there you go. Code of ethics in a nutshell.